It was a quiet evening, and the soft hum of the distant television echoed through the house. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her wine glass as she stared out of the window. The summer air was thick with the scent of jasmine, the warm breeze occasionally stirring the curtains. Her husband, Matt, was in the living room, glued to a football game, the soft murmur of his voice barely audible as he shouted encouragement to his team. But Olivia's thoughts were elsewhere. In the garage, just beyond the kitchen door, Matt's best friend, Ethan, was working on his motorcycle. He had been staying with them for the past week while his own house was undergoing some renovations. It had been Matt's idea, and Olivia had agreed without hesitation. After all, Ethan was practically family. But something had changed in the past few days. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The way Ethan's eyes lingered on hers a little too long, the casual brush of his hand against hers when passing her a dish or helping with something around the house. Each of these moments seemed innocent enough, but they stirred something in her that she couldn't quite explain. She sighed and took a sip of wine, trying to push the thoughts away. Matt trusted Ethan completely, and so did she. But there was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that had been tugging at her since he arrived. He was charming, in a quiet way. Where Matt was all loud jokes and bold gestures, Ethan was reserved, his humor dry and his smile just the faintest twitch of his lips. And yet, there was an intensity behind those quiet eyes that made her feel like he was seeing straight through her. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to have those eyes on her, focused, undistracted by the noise of life around them. The sound of a tool clattering to the ground snapped her out of her reverie. She looked toward the garage door. Ethan must have dropped something. She set her glass down, stood up, and walked toward the door, telling herself it was just to offer help, to be polite. The garage was dimly lit, the single bulb above casting a warm, yellow glow over the room. Ethan was crouched beside the motorcycle, fiddling with something on the engine. His shirt was smeared with grease, and his forearms were tanned and muscular, veins snaking up toward his rolled-up sleeves. "Everything okay in here?" Olivia asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, just dropped a wrench. Nothing serious." She nodded but didn't move. She couldn't quite explain why she stayed there, watching him, but there was something comforting about the quiet, about the soft sounds of the garage mixed with his presence. "Do you need help?" she offered, more out of politeness than any real intention to get involved. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. "I wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands." She hesitated, but only for a second, before stepping into the garage. The air was cooler here, and the scent of motor oil mixed with the faint remnants of Ethan's cologne hit her. He handed her a small tool, their fingers brushing as he did. The contact was brief, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her. "You know much about motorcycles?" he asked, his voice casual, though there was an underlying tension there, something unspoken. "Not a thing," she admitted with a small laugh, trying to shake off the strange pull between them. "But I'm a fast learner." "Good," he said, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment longer than necessary. "I'll teach you." And so they worked side by side, Olivia handing him tools, holding parts in place as he explained what he was doing. But the more time passed, the more the quiet moments between them seemed to stretch. Their arms brushed more often, their eyes meeting in fleeting glances that felt heavier with each passing second. At one point, Ethan reached across her to grab a wrench from the table behind her, and his chest brushed against her back. The contact was brief, but it was enough to make her heart race. She could feel the warmth of him, the solid weight of his presence, and she was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "Ethan," she began, her voice quieter than she intended. "Maybe I should." But before she could finish, he turned toward her, his eyes dark and serious, his hand coming up to gently brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was so soft, so intimate, that it took her breath away. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say or do. "Olivia," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we both know there's something happening here. her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, but she didn't move away either. The tension between them was palpable now, thick and heavy in the air. She could feel the heat radiating off him, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want to step back. "Ethan," she whispered, but even she wasn't sure what she was trying to say. His hand dropped from her hair, but instead of stepping back, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shiver down her spine. He took a small step closer, closing the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and rough, his breath warm against her skin. "If you want me to, I will." But she didn't say anything. She couldn't. The air between them was charged with something electric, something undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt truly alive. Ethan's hand slid up her arm, his fingers tracing the curve of her shoulder before resting against her neck. His thumb brushed her jaw, and she leaned into the touch without thinking, her body responding to him in a way that her mind couldn't quite comprehend. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself closing the remaining distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But then, as if a dam had broken, all the tension that had been building between them for days came rushing to the surface. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, as Ethan's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. Olivia's fingers tangled in his hair, and she kissed him back with a desperation she hadn't realized she was holding inside. The garage seemed to fade away, the rest of the world disappearing until there was nothing left but the feel of his body against hers, the warmth of his skin, the taste of him on her lips. They broke apart only when they were breathless, and even then, Ethan didn't move far. His forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. "This is wrong," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Matt, I know," he murmured, his hands still resting on her hips, his thumbs tracing soft circles against her skin. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this." She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a line they shouldn't cross, that this was dangerous, but the pull between them was undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to deny herself what she wanted. Ethan's lips found hers again, softer this time, slower, as if savoring the moment. And as she kissed him back, Olivia knew that there was no going back now. They had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. There always were. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. The night stretched on, the quiet hum of the world outside fading into nothing as they became lost in each other, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air, yet neither willing to pull away. Their bodies pressed closer, the intensity of their shared moments heightened with every touch, every lingering glance, and every whispered breath. Ethan's fingers grazed the edge of her waist, the heat of his palm radiating through the thin fabric of her shirt. He tugged her closer until their bodies were flush against one another, their shared heat mingling in the still air of the garage. For Olivia, the moment felt surreal, like a dream, yet terrifyingly real at the same time. There was something intoxicating about the feel of him, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, to wrap around her like a current she couldn't resist. She leaned into him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if holding on for dear life, unsure of where this was leading but unwilling to stop. "Ethan," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat as his lips found the sensitive skin of her neck. Her mind raced, battling between the weight of guilt and the overwhelming desire to let go, to lose herself in this moment with him. "Olivia," he murmured against her skin, his voice low and rough. "I've wanted this, wanted you, for longer than I should have." Her heart fluttered wildly in her chest at his admission, the confession hanging heavy between them. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she felt the same, that she had been fighting these feelings, too. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she tilted her head back, giving him access to the hollow of her throat, silently giving in to the pull of their desire. His lips were insistent but tender as they trailed down her neck, sending shivers along her spine. Olivia's breath hitched, and she couldn't help the small gasp that escaped her lips when his hands gripped her hips, anchoring her to him. It felt like they were suspended in time, their connection deepening with each passing second, every touch, every stolen breath pulling them further into the abyss. "I don't know how to stop this," she whispered, her voice trembling as her hands slid up his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. Ethan lifted his head, his gaze dark and intense as he looked down at her. His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "I don't want to stop," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But if you do, if you want me to walk away, tell me now." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She knew this was the moment to decide whether they could pull back from the edge before it was too late. But as she stared into his eyes, the depth of his desire mirroring her own, she realized she had already made her choice. Instead of answering, she closed the distance between them, capturing his lips in a kiss that spoke of everything she couldn't put into words. It was deep and desperate, fueled by the unspoken longing that had been simmering between them for days. Ethan responded instantly, his hands sliding up her sides, his fingers tracing the curve of her body as if memorizing every inch of her. The kiss grew more urgent, more frantic, as if they both knew that once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. Olivia's hands found their way to his hair, her fingers tangling in the soft strands as she pressed herself closer to him. The heat between them was palpable, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As their lips moved together, Ethan's hands roamed her body, his touch both gentle and insistent, like he was savoring the feel of her while battling the overwhelming urge to take more. He backed her up against the workbench, his body caging hers in, his lips never leaving hers as he lifted her onto the edge of the bench. Olivia's legs instinctively wrapped around his waist, pulling him closer, the contact sending a surge of heat through her body. They were lost in each other now, their bodies moving in perfect sync as they explored the depths of their forbidden connection. Each touch, each kiss, each breath seemed to stoke the fire between them, until it became all-consuming, drowning out the rest of the world. Olivia could barely think, her senses overwhelmed by the feel of Ethan's hands on her skin, the taste of him on her lips. She knew this was wrong, that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but in this moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was him, the way he made her feel, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else ever had. Ethan's lips found her collarbone, trailing soft, heated kisses down her neck as his hands slid beneath her shirt, his touch sending shivers down her spine. Olivia's head fell back, a soft moan escaping her lips as she arched into him, her body reacting to his every touch. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breathless, laced with both desire and uncertainty. He lifted his head, his gaze locking with hers, and for a moment, the intensity of the connection between them left her breathless. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that made her heart ache. "We shouldn't," she said softly, though her body betrayed her words as she pulled him closer, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. "I know," he whispered back, his forehead resting against hers. "But I can't stop. Not now." Olivia's breath hitched in her throat, her mind warring with her body as she tried to reconcile the depth of her feelings with the reality of the situation. But as Ethan's lips found hers again, all thoughts of guilt and consequence faded away, replaced by the overwhelming need to feel him, to be with him, even if just for this moment. The garage around them seemed to disappear, the world outside fading into oblivion as they gave into the pull of their desire. There was no turning back now, no going back to the way things were before. They had crossed a line, and they both knew it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of stolen kisses and whispered confessions, their bodies moving together with an urgency that spoke of the unspoken feelings they had both been suppressing for far too long. They were lost in each other, in the heat of the moment, the consequences of their actions forgotten in the haze of their passion. It wasn't until much later, when they were both lying in the dim light of the garage, their bodies entwined, that the weight of what they had done began to settle in. Olivia stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with a mixture of emotions, guilt, desire, confusion. She had never meant for this to happen, had never expected to feel this way about Ethan. And yet, here they were, tangled in each other's arms, their lives forever changed by this one night. Ethan's hand gently traced the curve of her back, his touch soothing, though she could feel the tension in his body, the unspoken thoughts weighing heavy between them. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to navigate the mess they had just created. "Olivia," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What are we going to do?" She closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of the question. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that something irrevocable had just happened, and there was no going back. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and now they were left to deal with the fallout. "I don't know," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know what happens next." The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of their shared guilt and the undeniable connection that had led them here. Ethan's arms tightened around her, as if trying to hold on to the moment before reality came crashing down around them. For now, in the stillness of the garage, they were safe, safe from the consequences, from the questions, from the guilt that would surely follow. But Olivia knew that this moment of peace wouldn't last. Sooner or later they would have to face the reality of what they had done. And when that time came, she wasn't sure if they would be able to survive it. But for now, she allowed herself to stay in his arms, to hold on to the warmth of his body, the comfort of his touch. Because whatever came next, whatever the future held for them, this moment, this connection, was theirs, and no one could take it away. As the night stretched on and the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the garage door, Olivia knew that everything had changed. And there was no going back. As the first slivers of dawn crept through the cracks in the garage door, painting the space in pale hues of morning light, Olivia lay motionless in Ethan's arms. The warmth of his body against hers should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It only served as a constant reminder of the line they had crossed, the irrevocable change that had taken place between them. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, desire, confusion, regret. She had wanted this, wanted him, but now that the night had passed, the reality of what they had done came crashing down with relentless force. She had betrayed her husband, the man who trusted her implicitly, who had no idea what had been happening right under his nose. Ethan stirred beside her, his hand resting against the small of her back, his touch soft but heavy with the weight of their shared guilt. He hadn't said much since they had succumbed to the pull between them. His quiet demeanor, once so alluring, now filled the silence with tension, the unspoken consequences hanging in the air between them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The garage, which had once felt like a secret world separate from reality, now seemed claustrophobic, closing in around them with the impending truth that would soon have to be faced. Olivia finally sat up, pulling herself from Ethan's embrace, her body aching not from the physical intimacy they had shared, but from the emotional toll it had taken. She glanced over at him, his eyes still closed, his brow furrowed as if even in sleep he was battling the same storm she was. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder would shatter the fragile peace of the morning. "We have to talk about this." He didn't move at first, but after a moment, he exhaled heavily and sat up beside her, his hands running through his hair in a gesture of frustration and uncertainty. His shoulders slumped, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I know," he said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of what they had done. "I don't know how we let it get this far." Olivia swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. "We can't pretend it didn't happen," she said, her voice trembling. We crossed a line, Ethan. A line we can't uncross." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the pain in his eyes mirrored her own. "I know," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't regret it. I can't regret it." His words hit her like a blow. How could he not regret it? How could he not feel the same crushing guilt that was suffocating her? She wanted to tell him that she did regret it, that this had been a terrible mistake, but the truth was far more complicated. She couldn't regret it either, not completely. There was a part of her, however small, that had wanted this, had needed this. She had felt something with Ethan, something deep and primal that she hadn't felt in a long time. It had awakened something inside her that she hadn't even realized had been dormant. But that didn't make it right. "Ethan, we can't do this again," she said, her voice firm despite the quiver in her chest. "We can't keep doing this. It'll destroy everything." His face tightened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might argue, as though he might try to convince her that they could keep whatever this was a secret, that they could live in this bubble they had created. But then, his expression softened, and he nodded, defeat settling over him like a heavy weight. "I know," he said, his voice low and resigned. "I know we can't." Silence fell between them again, thick and suffocating. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the reality that was closing in on them. The faint sound of birds chirping outside the garage felt like a cruel reminder that the world was still turning, that life would go on, even though everything had changed. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small, almost childlike in its uncertainty. Ethan let out a long breath and shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice filled with the same helplessness she felt. "I don't know how to fix this." Olivia closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She couldn't think about fixing anything right now. She couldn't even process what they had done, let alone how they were going to face Matt or explain this to him. The thought of it was too much, too overwhelming. But she knew one thing for certain. They couldn't stay in this place, couldn't continue down this path. They had to stop, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much they wanted to deny it. "I think you should go," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision she was making. "You can't stay here anymore." Ethan's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he looked as though he might argue, might beg her to reconsider. But then he nodded, his expression crumbling as he realized that there was no other option. He couldn't stay, not after what had happened. The longer he stayed, the harder it would be to keep their secret buried, the more tangled their emotions would become. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll go." The finality of his words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut, and she felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. She quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was no use. The enormity of what they had done, of what they had just lost, was too much to bear. Ethan stood up and began to gather his things in silence, the air between them heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. Olivia watched him, her heart aching with every movement he made, knowing that once he walked out that door, everything would be different. They couldn't go back to the way things were before. They had crossed a line that had forever altered their relationship, their lives. When he was ready to leave, he turned to her one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. He took a step toward her, as if he might reach out, might kiss her one last time, but then he stopped himself. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight with the effort of holding himself together. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For everything." Olivia nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. She wasn't sure if she could forgive him, or if she could forgive herself, but she knew that this was the only way. They couldn't keep lying to themselves, couldn't keep pretending that this was anything other than a terrible mistake. With one last, lingering glance, Ethan turned and walked out of the garage, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. And just like that, he was gone. Olivia stood there for a long time, her mind numb, her heart heavy. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know how she was going to face Matt or live with the guilt of what she had done. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. As the morning light filtered through the windows, she realized that she was alone now, truly, utterly alone. The connection she had shared with Ethan, however fleeting, had filled a void she hadn't even realized was there. But now that he was gone, all that was left was the hollow ache of loss and the unbearable weight of guilt. She sank down onto the cold concrete floor of the garage, her head in her hands, the tears finally falling freely. There was no going back. There was no undoing what had been done. All that remained was the silence, and the haunting realization that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed.